Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to go over the first movement of the Violin Sonata that I wrote. This is going to be a more relaxed, less serious video compared to my other videos, which serve as a lot more pedagogical. I'm going to go over some reasons why I wrote this, some things that led up to it, also how I wrote it, and then from there how I further continued it or elaborated on what I had, putting things in some different instruments. Here I just have piano and violin because it's a violin sonata, and during the classical period and after a violin sonata is commonly a work that has a piano and a violin, and they both create the piece, and the whole thing is a sonata, not to be mistaken for sonata form. This first movement is actually in sonata form, but where I'll be adding more movements to it, the whole thing will be called a violin sonata. I also have a video about sonata form. I'll link that in the description. So during this video on the left-hand side of the screen, we're going to look at some rough drafts and some things that I chose to include in my violin sonata, which you actually see on the right side. We're also just going to go through the violin sonata. I'm going to analyze some of the notes that I wrote down, further talk about those, and then just talk about the composing process as I go along the piece. We're going to listen to little examples of the music playing as we go, and the screen layout will remain the same to where the violin sonata in its finished form will always be on the right-hand side, where oftentimes they'll correlate and will be relevant to what's on the left-hand side, where you might see a rough draft or an earlier form of the idea for that. And then I have some notes written down where I was thinking, okay, how am I going to take these ideas and some of the things that I already had started in the violin sonata at the moment, and how can I actually turn this into a movement that is in sonata form? From there, I started thinking about the three sections of the sonata form: the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation. Of course, as you probably guessed, I started with building the exposition. And then after I wrote the exposition, I played it many times and listened to it for a few days over, slept on it, thought about it a lot. And then I started having more ideas pop up about how I was going to write the recapitulation. And that's probably because the exposition and the recapitulation are more similar in at least a basic sonata form structure than the development is going to be. Of course, the composer can choose to kind of twist and turn some things as they go, but I chose my exposition to be pretty similar to my recapitulation, which is sort of the conventional way of having a recapitulation where it reminds you of the beginning. It's like, okay, we're back to the beginning again, except the second theme is now in the home key instead of being in the conflicting key like it was earlier, a lot of times in the dominant key like I chose. Okay, and we'll see, I brainstormed some ideas, and from there I started getting other ideas and started thinking about some things, and then the end product is not exactly what I brainstormed in the beginning, but it helped me along the process come up with ideas, try things out, and think, oh, maybe I actually want to do this instead. So we're going to see a lot of things that helped me finish this end product, which finished at about 23 minutes, and it didn't realistically take me all that much time to write it. I probably at least took equal amounts of time taking a break and walking away from it, thinking about it, and not just rushing into anything. But how I do things is I often complete one section at a time, so I will sit down for a long period of time and complete and finish one section of something before I move on to the other thing. And as we're going to see in the development section, there's quite a lot of different sections that happen within that, and they all build on what is in the exposition. So sit back, follow along, and learn with me as I go over my first movement of my first violin sonata. Okay, so let's get into this. On the left-hand side, we can see a note where I'm saying that the high point to the end is used as a theme. And what this really is a beginning little section to the very first theme in the home key that is one of the main subjects of this first movement here. Okay, so now let's listen to this and we'll just see where I got the inspiration from. So first I listened to the beginning, and then I thought, okay, that high point, I like that. What if I start from the high point? So we'll just start from the beginning first off. Okay, so I liked it when it got to that high point, and again I was thinking, what if I started from there? Also seeing that the key that it's in at the time, it's chord 5. So I was thinking, okay, starting on chord 5, and then ending that little section on the tonic of that key. Okay, and remember, this is just a counterpoint exercise, so the point of this wasn't to sound really good or anything like that. It was just to do good counterpoint for the given melody, as you see in the left hand of the piano. Okay, so now listen to it from the high point to the end. Okay, and the reason why I kept that playing is because that's what originally happened. It kept playing, and then I thought I actually liked the sound of that. But what's really happening is it's modulating from one key to the next key on the next page, but it's not using a pivot chord or a pivot note or anything like that. It's literally just clashing from one key to the next key. And it's funny, that time I actually thought that sounded perfectly fine. The first time I thought it sounded kind of harsh. But either way, it's the fact that it just goes from one key to the next key, and I actually like how it sounded. So I was thinking, okay, I actually like this. And I'm a simple guy, so I was thinking, okay, so what if I just use this as the basis of theme 1? Okay, so now we're going to listen to this one by itself, and then we're going to see how I combined both of them together and just see how that sounds now that we're going to be familiar with this one. Okay, so for me, this one was a lot more heartfelt. I listened to it and I thought, oh, I actually like how that sounds. I think every time that I heard the suspension, it was a moment that really stood out to me. For me, it kind of has a loving, sort of romantic quality to it, even though it's very simple at this moment. And a lot of this is having to do with me putting it in the violin. So what I originally did, as you can see, is I just had the piano, and the left hand has the cantus firmus, or the given melody, for the counterpoint. I wrote the counterpoint over the top of that on the right hand of the piano, just doing 2-voice counterpoint, so there's just one note against one note, but being floored counterpoint, the ratio of the right hand is free to choose what it wants to, but I'm striving in this to try to do some suspensions as well, so you can see some of those suspensions, and then you can also see some like eighth note elaboration, note fills, passing tones, and also some quarter tone passing tones. So it's just a counterpoint response, and then I took that right hand of the piano and I just copied that exact thing in the violin. With MuseScore, very conveniently, I could just copy and paste it, and then listening to it, I could listen to both of them at the same time. I could think, okay, not only what parts do I want in the violin or piano, or maybe I just want the whole thing in the violin or the whole thing in the piano. But now with just another instrument, but now with just two instruments, the piano and the violin, even just playing the exact same notes, it's a lot more musical. So this gave me a glimpse of what I actually wanted originally. I also had a cello with this, and then I had the cello either playing the whole notes, or I had the cello playing the melody, but in the register where the cello would normally be. And it wasn't the fact that I didn't like the cello in there, but I was thinking, okay, well, I just wrote a violin solo. I haven't done any piano music, which I really am looking forward to releasing a lot of that pretty soon here. So I was thinking, okay, just a simple next step from that violin solo is only like 2 or 3 minutes. I was just stepping my foot into writing for violin. Let me do a violin sonata, so I can actually combine the piano and the violin together, which will give myself more of a challenge, but will also give myself a little more freedom when I have 2 instruments now. Not only that, now I can practice for writing for the piano and the violin at the same time. So it seemed like a good time to do this because I want to study the cello on its own. I want to compose a simple little cello solo piece and then start to include pieces with cello. I want to do the same thing with viola. I don't know if I'm going to do a solo double bass piece. I didn't really think about that. Maybe I'll try to do that. But whatever it is, that is my approach. This is actually what Thomas Goss was recommending, and he was further recommending that if you want to compose music, like let's say a symphony one day, definitely you shouldn't really start off with that, but you should start off with simple chamber music and work up to it slowly, and even from there you shouldn't start off with something like a string quartet, but something simpler like a violin sonata, as you see I started with here. So I thought it was really good advice, and it turned out to work out really well. The violin solo that I wrote before this, which he also recommended on doing, forced me to have to learn how to write for the violin because I was just doing a solo violin piece, and because of that, I had to basically fill the whole thing with the violin playing. No matter if I wanted to have a bass line to the song or if I just wanted to have the melody on the top, I wanted both at the same time. I would now have to figure out how I can do that with this one instrument. So this was a great challenge, and actually being so limited, it caused me to think about many things, and the whole point of it is I wanted it to actually be able to be played by a player if they wanted to play it one day. So doing so, I had to study the violin, and I did. Study all the strings that it has, understand the relationship of the strings, and then the fingerboard, how the violin actually plays the notes that it does by pressing the note and playing with the bow, the differences in the up bow, down bow, slurring the notes, having détaché bowing, and also fingering positions. So knowing, okay, if I wanted a chord or if I'm just playing even a melody and I want the player to actually be able to play this, how can I write this so it's not going to be impossible for the player to play? So when I came here to the Violin Sonata with the piano and violin now, I had a lot more freedom now having the piano, where the piano has a lot more freedom in what it can play. But also with this, I wanted to make the violin part interesting. One of my favorite things with bowed stringed instruments is when they play chords. I love the sound of that. So I made sure to include many chords for the violin, which now in the end turns out this might be a little bit difficult for the violinist to play if there was one violinist. So of course someone could always take this piece and instead of having one violin play the part, two violins could play the part when you have more of those chords and a lot more notes, as we'll see when I analyze this. So for now it's a violin sonata for violin and piano, but it could very well be a sonata for piano and two violins, or you could call it a piano trio, and it could just be for one piano and two violins. Okay, now we see the original piano copy where the beginning section is that high point and the end of that one response that was in D major. We can see then it goes on to the next line where there's the next theme that was in F major, which is the tonic key of the first movement here. By tonic key, it just means that it was the key that was introduced as the main first theme, which then it goes back to at the very end. Okay, and this is only with piano, so let's give this a listen. And the reason why it sounds like the pianist is pressing on the key so hard is because it's in fortissimo right here. I put it there just so I could listen to it really well and hear it a lot, but it showed me that it added a dramatic weight to it, so I could use this to my advantage when I wanted to. Okay, and we're going to hear that again with violin and piano, since that is the main theme of this. So now let's move on. This is called the Sunny Afternoon Score, and this is because I was sitting in the sun one day, I had a notebook, I didn't know what I was going to do. I think I was drawing some stuff. And then I was like, well, why do I make good use of this time and actually start writing some music? From there, without the anacroustic start, that very first beginning note, I wrote the bass line, the whole notes that you can see in the left hand, which sometimes go into the right hand, as you can also see. But the point is, that's the given melody to where then I wrote counterpoint above it. It was kind of funny. I have an alternate ending here, which shows a bracket between two sections, which the other version without this alternate ending on a foundational level is basically the same exact thing without these two measures here. And it's actually a funny reason for that. When I was writing it, I wrote those two measures in the side of the page where that red line is on a piece of paper. So I don't know why, but because I wrote those two measures over there, my brain didn't think about it, and when I was writing my response, I skipped those two originally. So the counterpoint made perfect sense with me skipping those two measures. And then I thought, oh shoot, I actually meant to have those two measures in there, so why don't I actually complete it with those two measures now? And then I could either figure out which one I like better, or I could have, like I chose here, one with an alternate ending and one without. Okay, so now let's first give this a listen with only piano. Okay, so now that was more of a finished product that I included in the Violin Sonata, and you can see that now on the right hand side with the violin included, and this is because originally I had the idea to start this very simply, as you see on the left here, where this is how this started as I was writing it outside in the sun, and I wanted to have only whole notes and also some half notes, and then at the end I had a little bit of some quarter notes leading up to a slow ending. I wanted this theme to be a lot slower. Even though the first one wasn't incredibly fast, I wanted this one to be slow. So I wanted both of my themes to be rather peaceful, nothing super dramatic and exciting, but as we'll see, I chose my transitionary and my intro passages to be more exciting, which then I used in my development section. Okay, so we'll first listen to the original version, just piano, and then I'll add the violin so we can hear the difference. Okay, now I'm adding the violin, and the violin is just playing what was written above the given melody, also known as the counterpoint response. We can see it's very peaceful, almost a little boring, so that's why I wanted to make it a little more exciting, but this is the foundational idea. So at least for a foundational idea, there's no parts that sound really bad or anything like that, and personally for me, this is what I want. From here, I can work with this, I can add some things in the middle of this, and make this more interesting. Okay, so now let's listen to what I did to make this a little more interesting. But first, we can just look at this and observe what I did. In the beginning, instead of just having the whole note, as you can see, I have every note that the first whole note is played as a quarter note right before it. An anacoustic start is often on the upbeat, as you can see here, and it often chooses the note of or a note in the tonic chord or the dominant chord. As you can see here, it's just repeating all of the notes that are in the first tonic chord. So now let's give this a listen. Okay, so there it is. One thing to note is the note durations of this theme. This is the second theme here, the Sunny Afternoon score theme. And here we can see the main notes chosen for the long duration notes are whole notes, and the regular duration notes other than that are the half notes. We also see some half note suspensions as well, and we see some but not a lot of quarter notes which serve as the faster paced notes in here. We do not see a single eighth note in here at all. I personally didn't think it really fit. So we can see that one of the characteristics of this theme has to do with the note durations chosen. Compared to the first theme, the slower note durations were the half notes and also the suspended half note to half note, which is a whole note duration. But other than that, the regular duration notes were the quarter notes, and the faster duration notes were the eighth notes again in that first theme. So there we did have some eighth notes, and that is just one of the small conflicts of theme 1 and theme 2, which definitely helped to build and inspire the development section. You also see I added a fermata in here, so there's that pause. I just thought it seemed like a good moment. I was also listening to a lot of Bach at the time, and he randomly puts fermatas at certain places, and they just seem to fit really well. I don't have a ritardando going to the fermata, which is customary, but it is already very slow as it is. I didn't do it here, but another thing to note is that sometimes people do, I wouldn't call it a fake ritardando, but it sort of has that effect to where in the music when they're reaching a point, maybe like here you have a fermata, or maybe you just have a tonic note that's drawn out like a whole note. Leading up to that, you just have slower note durations, maybe even what was playing before is now rhythmically diminished. So in that case, there's not the ritardando written, but it still can have that effect. Some composers do this quite well. Okay, so that's with the alternate ending there. We also after this have without the alternate ending, and you can see that right here, but the point of this video is not to play this entire thing. If you do want to listen to this, it will be linked in the description. But for now that I talked about theme 1 and 2, I want to go through the pages in order and tie this all together now. Okay, now we're back at the beginning again, and we can listen to what I did with the piano and the violin together, where this is where we have the intro with that one key, and then it leads into the key of the tonic in the first theme combined. Okay, so now let's check this out. Okay, so as you can see, I kept everything very similar than what I had from the beginning, and what I mainly did is put certain parts in the piano, certain parts in the violin, and then also added some more notes to everything. And this is for a few reasons. One, because I listened to it and I liked how it sounded, how it was, and because of that simplicity, I wanted to further develop it, but first allow it to be shown in a very simple nature to begin with so you could grasp it, and then I could make it a lot more complex and do some stuff with it, and at least you could hear that as familiar to what you heard in the beginning. Well, if I just started off with all the complex stuff, it might be a little too crazy. So that's one of the reasons. The second reason is I wanted someone to be able to study this if they wanted to, and see how I got the material originally, and then develop that into this score, where a lot of what I did in my exposition section is just taking what I originally had, and even though it wasn't the most exciting rhythmically, melodically, or harmonically, I wanted to post that as a sort of challenge to myself at the same time to say, okay, how can I work with this and actually develop it to make it musical? Of course, adding some more notes and also doing some more interesting stuff, but keeping it very simple in the exposition section. So then after putting this together and listening to this, I thought, okay, so I like this. I want to repeat theme 1 again somehow. Definitely not exactly how I did here, but I wanted to do it in a way to where there's more violin chords now. And here we are on the second page. You'll see on the third page I added a lot more violin chords. But here we are on the second page. I thought, before just throwing a bunch of violin chords into it and throwing the listener into that, why don't I instead build up to that and kind of hint that? So first, I chose to repeat a small section of the main melody so you can get ready for the violin to do chords on the next page. Okay, and we will listen to this because we'll see how this then prepares our ears for hearing the violin chords coming next. And we'll see how maybe if I just started with those violin chords, we may not have been ready with first a sort of bridge or introduction to that. Okay, so now moving on to the next page, we can see some more chords here. I wrote this not too long after studying some of Bach's solo violin works. One was the Partita 3 for solo violin, which I actually completely rescored in MuseScore. That was actually a really fun exercise. I should talk about that in a whole video at some point, because rescoring the entire piece really helped me analyze it so much more than I would have if I would just tried reading it or even taking notes as I was listening and reading to it multiple times. Just sitting down and scoring the whole thing and analyze what I was doing the whole time. It was a great learning experience. So I was sort of inspired to write some violin chords with counterpoint by listening to those solo violin works by Bach. Definitely not saying in any means that this is to the level of Bach's writing or anything like that. It's the fact that his writing inspired me just to do some more complex stuff with the violin, where a lot of times you see the violin is written to just play one line in a piece or maybe a song. But I in fact wanted to practice scoring for the potential of what the violin can do. And that is doing things like, as you can see, triple stops here, double stops with counterpoint in the middle of it, where we have one finger holding one note on the bottom, and we have two different fingers actually playing the notes on the top. Where then my favorite thing about counterpoint is not just the two distinct lines being completely distinct, but the balance of that happening and then the notes colliding like you see here and creating that nice harmony. So see, it's not all just two notes harmonizing together, it's not all just counterpoint, it's a little bit of a balance of both. I basically wrote it to how I thought it would fit at the moment of time, to where we don't always have double stops. We do have a lot of double stops. We do also have some triple stops. And then there's just simple things like double stops of thirds here, where it's just playing a line of notes a third apart from each other. And then some more complex things to where we actually see two different voices with the stems going upside down and then the stems going up. Those are two different voices. We see that one finger would be holding this note for 3 beats, and then from there they have to play two different fingers on these eighth notes here. And then the same thing where here on the beginning we see some notes where they're playing a different string, another voice, and we see the finger has to switch between all these notes now on the top. So some more complex stuff, but I wrote it to where it would make sense and it would be able to be played. And we can also see I wrote the fingerings down, but I don't know if that's exactly what the violinist would prefer. So if you are a violinist and don't mind telling me if I did a good job on writing these fingerings for the notes. Okay, so now let's give this a listen with the chords. Okay, so then from there I was thinking, okay, so now we had the violin, and the violin was doing a lot in the melody in the beginning, and then we just had a whole section of the violin doing not only the octaves, but then that whole page of it doing a bunch of chords. Where basically, for the moment, the violin's stealing the show. So I thought, okay, let me give the piano a chance now. So as we can see from the note, the theme is now restated in piano, and it is a variation. So the whole theme from the first page, that little intro, and then the actual full part of the theme is now restated as a variation. Okay, so now we're going to give this a listen, but first we're going to listen to the last line of the page before, because it leads up to this, and how it goes together will show why I wrote what I did. Okay, so as you see, the melody was mainly in the piano, but the violin was still such a main component of it, even though for a lot of it was playing a lot slower notes. The violin's sound just projects a lot more, and of course this isn't an actual recording of them playing it. This is just played through MuseScore, so you could always have the players play it a little differently in real life, but for now we can see that the violin's sound projects a lot more, which poses a sort of risk for the piano to stick out, even when the piano is, like it is here, playing a lot faster note durations. Then we also see some conflicting harmony with the chords chosen, or at least that's the way I see it. And then from here I was thinking, okay, so I have theme 1, I have theme 2, how do I get from one to the other? And of course I know you have a bridge section, and a lot of times in sonata form, you're going to be choosing the subdominant key of that tonic key from the first theme. So we'll see back on the left-hand side here, I constructed a ending of the transitionary passage from theme 1 using chord 4, but it's in minor, it's not a major chord 4, leading into C major for theme 2. The only thing is, as you can see, this is the ending of the transitionary passage, so I still don't have the beginning of that. Okay, so here we are on the left screen, and here's where I wanted to make some dramatic chords. We're going to listen to these in a second, and we're going to analyze this in a second, because what happened is, as you see in the note here, I said something dramatic like Mahler 2. I listened to this chord here, and I thought, okay, that sounds like a chord in a very dramatic moment in Mahler 2. So I wanted to use that to my advantage, but as we'll see in a second here, I got confused, and it actually led to something very interesting. Okay, so we're going to get into that in a second, but I kind of want to do this in order. Okay, so now we're looking back at the right page again, where it's actually the Violin Sonata. On the page before, we had that piano variation where the theme was restated. And now here we are on the next page where you see the note says, create a variation to lead into B minor, but do not make it too much like the original where someone would notice. I ended up kind of scratching the thing where someone would notice, so this sort of builds off of what you heard in theme 1, but then from there it builds a sort of nature where you think, okay, I might know where this is going now, but then that just leads into another section where from there we go to a whole nother place. So we're going to just analyze this transitionary passage, and then we'll just listen to the whole thing. Okay, so we're at the end where you kind of thought you knew what was going on a little bit now, but then it just goes into something else where you're like, okay, I don't know exactly what's going on. From there, I'll remind you, I already had the ending of this transitionary passage already completed. So now I was just thinking, okay, so how do I get there? And the thought process here was that here on the left page, you can see these notes go up pretty high. So I was thinking, okay, so how do I lead up to those high up notes? And I was imagining in my head a run that just went way up from sort of a middle register, maybe even down low, but got to a high point where there's just a single line going da 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 da, and then it gets to that super high point to where then it goes to here where you have these high notes with the actual chord. So ba da ba da ba da ba, and then chord da. That's what I was picturing, and we'll see that's what I did. First, I have some chords here to kind of change up the harmony and also changes up the rhythm a little bit, and then I get into this section to where we'll see the main focus is what's happening in the violin. The violin has this run that starts up from B in the middle line of the treble staff, and it goes up playing an odd rhythm with some triplets missing the middle note. That goes up, sometimes it plays the weird triplet rhythm, sometimes it doesn't, and then at the end it all comes together to where we get to that very high point. It's sort of a creepy sounding moment. But before moving on to the next page, let's first look at the counterpoint. So the piano, the very top line, is going all down. It's going all down while the violin starts in the middle and goes up towards the top. So if you compare the piano and where it's going and the violin, they're sort of crossing each other and making an X, all while at the same time the left hand of the piano is just going up steadily. So there's some cool contrary motion going there. Okay, here we are on the next page. I want this to be a very dramatic moment where we have a very high point, it goes down a little lower, and then we have this low point here. We have another transition that leads us to another high point. We go back down, and we think, okay, we're going to go back down to that low note again. And on the left-hand page, this is where I was here, where I was thinking, okay, this is kind of a dramatic moment with this chord that's right here. What do I do after this? I wanted something really dramatic, like in Mahler 2. So I couldn't really think of anything. Let's listen to what I finished off with. I was kind of picturing a note after that or a chord after that, but no matter what I was choosing, nothing quite fit. So we'll see what I came up with was actually something a lot more peaceful, to where it actually resolved into a chord of C major, which is then repeated throughout this section. It keeps resolving to C major from a sort of tension chord, and that gets us ready for theme 2, which is C major. Where then on the next page we can see the sunny afternoon score, which is theme 2. So let's listen to that transitionary section now as a whole. Okay, so then from there it goes on to theme 2. Looking back at this last page here, I'd say that listening to, I could see where it could definitely use some improvement. But that's why I'm glad that I actually wrote this. I'm not shooting for like a masterwork or anything like that, obviously, here. I'm more just kind of practicing and also using this as a teaching example for people that would want to learn from it. But listening back to this, I could see that, okay, my main goal here was to kind of do something with the harmony, and I did accomplish that. But what I didn't really accomplish here is anything melodically. Of course, this could just be a period where that is what's going on. There's not a lot of melody, it's just chords and chords. But I think it's a little too many chords. I think there should be something more melodic here going on. I did get the goal of the harmony down with the chords, but the thing that I didn't really check off was an actual interesting melodic line, or really anything actually interesting melodically happening here at all. Rhythmically, it's kind of obvious what's going on. It's very repetitive, and also even with the chords, what's going on is very repetitive in the entirety of most of the section except for the beginning. So I find it a little boring and could use some improvement. I think a lot of it could just be a simple melodic line would do the trick. Okay, then we get into theme 2. Kind of already talked about this, and we also did listen to this, so we'll actually give a listen to the next page, and we'll see the difference between this and the alternate ending. So take a good look at this, we'll go on to the next page. Here we are on the next page. Let's first just give it a listen. Okay, there we see the alternate ending, and did you also notice something about the counterpoint at all with your ears? Or maybe also you saw it as well. You can really hear with your ears if you pay attention. And that is that, okay, we have the violin playing these whole notes here. In the beginning, it's just playing those whole notes. Not only in the beginning, but then throughout that, I kept that as a theme to where you see on the bottom, the violin is always playing a whole note in every measure, sometimes even doing a suspension of that whole note, where some of those slurs might be a little long for a single bow stroke on the violin, but this was just the idea, and it was showing the suspension. Of course, I could delete this slur right here, because that would be a little too long for a violin bow, but the main reason that I'm pointing out the whole notes is that if we pay attention to the whole notes on the bottom in line 2, in line 3, all of a sudden the counterpoint flips, and the counterpoint crosses. The voices cross to where now the whole notes are on the top. And not only that, but the whole notes were slowly going from the bottom here kind of up a little bit and back to the middle register, but they're slowly making their way up to where when they flip, now they're up high and they're going up even higher. So listen back to that. It has a really nice effect to it. But then from there, I didn't want it to be hard to follow, so you also see that from the whole notes switching places, then that happens for only 2 measures, but then that collides into the next measure where now both the notes become whole notes and the rhythm sort of slows down, and then we have more whole notes and slower notes preparing us to the end, where we see a classic 7/6 suspension here in the piano. And you see the violin plays off that foundation of those notes. Here we can see a note. I said the end of the exposition question mark. I was wondering. I was saying, does it need a codetta, which would translate to small tail, meaning that it would be a small ending to the exposition section of this first movement. You could also have a coda, which could be at the very end of the actual movement. But since this is just the exposition here, I was thinking, okay, is this actually the exposition? Or maybe I need that codetta. But then I was saying, it's probably good here because a codetta is useful when the ending is not convincing enough. And personally, I thought this ending was convincing enough. I mean, it was very slow, and I actually did not change keys or modulate in either of my themes, if you noticed, which actually I like to modulate. So I kept things extremely simple for this first movement of this first violin sonata, where then I gave myself more freedom in the development section to do key changes, change keys, modulate in the middle of a phrase or something. And one reason is this was all built off the material in the beginning. So I kept everything really simple, with the theme being in one key, the second theme being in another key. We just went over the transitionary section, and that was in one key. But in the beginning, I also had a prelude, which was in a different key. And that's very useful to what happens in the development section, the key that it's actually in. And also the prelude theme serves as one of the main conflicting themes throughout the development section. So you'll see if you give this a listen, the prelude is just one page that happens before this first page that we saw of the Violin Sonata. I thought, okay, there's a lot of slow stuff happening here, and my transitionary moment had some more exciting stuff. Why don't I make a more exciting little section in the beginning that leads up to everything? Kind of gets their listener on their toes and also hints at some things that we're going to see throughout the entirety of this piece. Okay, so I also wanted the prelude to be a little different, and I had a sort of interesting idea here. So I thought, why don't I do some metric modulation? I'm going to write a section that is in 3/4 time, but I'm going to write an amount of notes that would work perfectly if I wanted to then put this in 4/4 time. So that's what I did. You'll see that the first page is written in 4/4 time, and it's kind of an odd rhythm, and that's because it's actually a 3/4 time, which then I put in 4/4 time, which can kind of throw off the listener's expectations for what they're going to expect the rest of the piece to be, since the beginning starts off in a 3/4 time. And the reason why I put this in 4/4 time, I didn't just keep it in 3/4 time, is because this theme and parts or fragments of this theme become one of the main topics of the development section. And how I wrote this one was kind of interesting. I was actually just sitting back talking to someone one day. We're doing a video call on the computer. They were writing something on Ableton actually, and I wanted to write something here on MuseScore, so I started writing down a cantus firmus using dotted half notes, as you can see in the left hand of the piano, where that served as the foundation for the counterpoint, which was originally a piano score, but then I started putting some things in the piano and some things in the violin. And this one I basically kind of just went along and wrote and listened to it as I went. I actually wrote this very quickly. And then by the end of it, I liked how it sounded, and originally I just wrote it randomly, not as a prelude. I didn't originally write it for the intro or anything. And then I listened to it, and I thought, wait, why don't I put that as the intro? So first I tried it out. I listened to it and then listened to the piece. And then I thought, okay, I don't quite know if I like that. I think I waited a day or two and then decided if I was going to do it. And then I decided, okay, I'm going to add that as the intro, a prelude. Okay, so now we see what was written in 3/4 time, now in 4/4 time. I don't know if I added much of anything else. We do see that in the beginning, there's an appoggiatura for the piano, which I thought rhythmically just helped with what was going on here. And also rhythmically, not only is this in a 3/4 time originally, but it's different compared to what's going on in the rest of the other themes and with the transition between those themes as well. Okay, so let's give this a listen. has an ending kind of in that nice chord there, which is the chord that is the key of the intro to theme 1, which, as we saw, was actually D major, and theme 1 is actually in F major. So it's not anything crazy, but in the beginning it doesn't just land on one key. Here we can actually see this is an A minor right now for the prelude. Then the other two keys are just because I wrote this. So I guess earlier I said that the themes don't really modulate, and that's because I don't really consider theme 1 to be the section of D major to F major. I consider F major to be theme 1. So like we see on the right hand here where there's the second line, this is where it starts in F major, I consider this to be theme 1. While above that, what was in D major, I consider that just to be the intro to theme 1. So I guess it's a sort of modulation, but I don't really consider that to actually be theme 1. Okay, so now we went over the prelude, the intro, and we also went over the exposition section. Now let's move on to the development section. So my notes here I wrote, having only piano and then violin or vice versa happens in many sonatas, but I was inspired to practice that here. Where it is the beginning of the development section, this leads into a very quiet moment that adds balance to the contrast of the themes and their extremities, which further develop through this development section. So we see there's no violin whatsoever here, except for in the very last line in the third beat of that last measure there. We see the violin playing a double stop of an octave. On to the next page, we see that everything quiets down. Here, there's nothing really too fast-paced going on with any eighth notes. We do see some quarter notes, but everything is kind of getting quieter, so it's kind of becoming a more peaceful moment. We have some quarter notes and then some half notes with some longer pauses, and we see the diminuendo in the piano happening twice throughout some measures. Quieting everything down, the violin goes down to mezzo piano. We're on the next page. Now we have the piano and mezzo piano and the violin and piano, and keep in mind that these dynamics in here are to accomplish the sound that I wanted as an end product for the playback of MuseScore. If I actually wanted people to perform this, I would completely erase all the dynamics that I basically wrote, and I would rewrite them completely differently, but then it wouldn't sound quite right for the MuseScore playback, so that's the reason why I have the dynamics that I do. In real life, I would just have a piano in both the piano and the violin, and the players would know to not have the violin play a lot louder than the piano, but here in MuseScore, if you write the piano and violin together both in piano, then you're going to hear the violin so much more that to have them equal out more, I actually ended up putting the piano in mezzo piano and the violin in piano. And we'll give it a listen. We can see that the volume is very similar between both of them. Okay, we can see everything gets quiet, but then it continues to get even quieter, and that kind of gets continuously quiet. But in this moment, I want to point it out, because if you actually pay attention to this rhythm, kind of like another metric modulation real quick, I think it's these three measures here that you see where there's a 5/4 rhythm that uses invertible counterpoint, and I kind of hinted at that. And then throughout later parts of the development section, I threw more of that in there to where I wrote separately this 5/4 counterpoint response that uses invertible counterpoint of the octave, so it can just be placed above and below the canus firmus. Okay, so listen to that now. And here we are back in sort of the beginning again, but as we can see, some things are a little different. So we have some staccato happening on the piano now, then the violin is playing notes that we see staccato and accents, and then we see that continues with the piano and the violin doing that. So sort of repeats the melody again in a uplifty, jumpy fashion. So now with that in mind, let's give that a listen. And we see a lot more key changes now. Things are modulating. We have some accidentals, random hints at keys in the middle, and then actually modulating to different keys from different pages and stuff like that now that we're here in the development section. We also see that this is building off the theme 1 and 2 that we had. It's sort of mixing and merging the themes together. There we saw a lot of just theme 1, but we're going to see now that it's going to be mixing theme 1 and theme 2 together. And we actually see a note of that here. We see 4 measures of the intro theme. So that's the intro theme to the first theme. And then we have 4 measures of theme 1, and then 2 more measures of the intro theme again, and then 4 measures of theme 2 fill in the 4 measures deleted from theme 1 that would have created the ending to theme 1, but instead we have theme 2. Going on to the next page, the last line is basically completely original to everything else that we saw before, and it's some new material. And we see some modulations to some different chords, where when I have the 6, that's a 6 chord, so I just mean a first inversion triad. So we see a G6, then we see a G6 with C, then that goes to an E7 over A chord, that goes to an F4-3 chord, so an F7 chord second inversion, and then after that we see what I call an F11 chord, that goes to another F11 chord voiced differently. Going on to the next page, the F11 chord hangs over, I forget the exact reason why I chose to use that, it was something with the harmony, and then it goes to a B major chord. The note G sharp gives us a taste of A major, but this is really A minor, thinking about A harmonic minor. This then modulates to B flat major, but then finds its way to E flat major, with some brief interruption of D major along the way. Furthermore, it lands in A major from the A7 chord. So this is where I kind of just wanted a lot of modulations to happen. I wanted to go through a bunch of different keys, so then the listener would get used to, okay, we're going to be changing keys now. I also wanted this to serve as a dramatic moment, because I had a lot of peaceful moments in the beginning of this development section, and sort of the theme of this whole movement is that I have peaceful moments, and then I have sort of faster, louder, more dramatic moments in the middle and surrounding those peaceful moments. So here we are back in one of those more fast-paced, louder, dramatic moments. We have a lot more fast-paced stuff. We have these dramatic chords. We have these sharp key changes. And also we have a lot of key changes that aren't just sharp, but they use a lot of pivot chords. So just a lot of key changes in general. And we'll see that here on this last line, we're using a lot of pivot chords and notes that are close together, while also doing counterpoint, doing things like contrary motion, to accomplish a bunch more modulations, which further keep going on to the next page. So just first, to start off, we have a B flat 7, which goes to a C6 chord. That goes to an A flat 7 chord, which takes us to a G diminished 4-3 chord. That then takes us briefly to C major / A minor. Then we go to F major with a B flat note in there. Then we go to E major with the B flat and A flat notes in this chord. Then with this note, we could be somewhere from E flat to A flat major. Here we use a tritone substitution with a D half diminished tritone to a D flat 7 chord. So you see the notes spelled out. We have a D, F, A flat, and C, which is a D half diminished containing that tritone, which then just goes to a D flat 7 chord, D flat, F, A flat, and C. So very similar notes there, but we also see everything is voiced differently, so it's not just the same notes going to the same notes of different accidentals, but it's a lot more exciting than that. Then we see the bottom note in the violin here in the first note of the second to last measure. Then this becomes the beginning of this melodic line, where we see the next note is the same note, where we have the beginning of a melodic line, taking us out of all these key changes and chords and half notes, where we have a sort of solo melodic violin line that harmonically, for me as the artist, it's kind of questioning what's going on here. Like, what's going on here? Not really even sure with the melody. Where are we going to go next? Where are we currently right now? Because after hearing all these chords and the notes and the harmonies and the high pitches and the low pitches, you're kind of still sitting there thinking about it after. But instead now we completely switch to a completely different, kind of questionable, not quite sure sounding melodic solo violin line, which then goes to a trill of a violin and then a piano chord which also trills a note, and the trill here was more used as an effect. Where then from there something similar than what happened with the solo melodic line of the violin happens in the piano, but this time it's leading us into another trill where we're having some key changes. After that, the violin goes into a fingered glissando, and with that I mean the glissando is not just sliding down the notes, playing all the notes along the line of that glissando, but also the notes in between it just sliding down the string, but instead it's a fingered glissando, to where it's a glissando that's playing the exact chromatic notes that are in between that run from one note to another note. And we see an upper A going to a lower A, so just an octave fingered glissando of an A. All that while the piano does a scalar run of A going up from the same A that the violin finishes on, and then it goes to the same A that the violin started on. So they're sort of doing the opposite there. See, that idea further remains, but it doesn't exactly happen at the same time or in the same nature like that anymore after that. We see another fingered glissando where there's actually an A an octave up from before, going back down to another A, so another octave glissando. See some contrary motion in the piano, and then a chord sort of pausing everything. And then we have a glissando of a tritone while the piano is doing a slurred melody of some notes in contrary motion to that, where they both lead up at the same time to a chord, where before those chord moments they're sort of off from each other rhythmically. Then after this, the piano and the violin play another chord together, going on to the next page. Let's actually listen to the page before this and this page. Let's also listen to the next page because this is where everything ends, so we'll just now analyze the next page. We'll see the chord hangs over as a suspended chord, which finally resolves into C major. Then we have a fermata, finally kind of slowing everything down. So that's sort of the end of that section, and then everything just keeps going past this again. So that's page 19. We'll actually go back to page 16 though, and we'll listen to some of these chord changes. We'll just start on the second line here so we kind of get prepared for everything. Listen to these chords and these key changes, see if you like the sound of this or not, because I completed these chords with these key changes thinking with theory concepts of modern tonal harmony. I actually like how they turned out, and it was me practicing chords and modulations using pivot notes and stuff like that. So it's kind of a cool feeling of me just saying, okay, I'm gonna get all these random notes and I'm gonna see what notes are in this key and what notes are in that key. And I don't remember exactly what I did, but I did a lot of things like pivot chords and just interesting things like you'd expect one chord to go into another chord, but it goes into a slightly different version of that chord, which then is in a different key. And then from there, sometimes you'd expect, okay, then from that chord, you'd expect that chord now to go to a different chord. And I keep kind of throwing off your expectations. I do a lot of stuff like that. So let's give it a listen. Okay, so you see again that little solo violin, that unsure solo violin line. I think this is a variation of the original one, but it's that similar idea to where you have that solo violin line kind of taking you from all these chord changes and these note durations. Okay, so pay attention when you hear this low F here in the left hand of the piano, because in the transitionary passage of the exposition, this note happened right before the transition from sort of a slow period to these really high-pitched notes. So it sort of serves as a trigger for an expectation of something dramatic. And I use this because I keep building up to a moment that you think might be dramatic, and then I keep getting slightly louder, but I don't quite do the dramatic chord of the super high-pitched chord, and I keep just kind of making it super peaceful and drag on. From here, it's already kind of quiet, and it gets a little louder in this moment, but then after this note, you'll hear that it actually just gets quiet right after it, and then it starts kind of building up again, but then it changes and it goes somewhere else. Okay, so then on the next page, we see that low F here, but it's not really serving the same, but we see on the third line, or the bottom line, we see the note F again right here in the left hand of the piano, and we'll hear how this is another moment leading towards a dramatic moment. It keeps getting louder, and then it'll play that note, which you think is a trigger for a bunch of chords, and it keeps not playing that, but in this case it actually does finally play it, so you finally go to it. So if you listen back to this, just listen for that, to where it keeps leading you up to that moment, and the reason why you feel that way is because I keep using the same note and the chord to imply the moment that we think there's going to be this dramatic chord happening after, because that's what happened originally in the exposition. Okay, so we see multiple things that happened earlier that were leading towards dramatic moments happening, but then it keeps leading out of it, and then it finally leads to it. The other thing is that melody, starting from here with this, and then something similar happening here. Where you finally get the dramatic moment and that high-pitched chord. Okay, now going back to where we left off, page 19, we ended that whole section and what was going on there. And then out of it, we have that kind of weird solo violin line emerging again. So we'll just listen to this page, and then we'll listen to the next page, and then we'll analyze what happened. Okay, we'll see here, the next page gets a little more exciting here. So there's kind of some sections here. This page was more lyrical with the playing of the instruments, and it has a sort of familiar essence to it. And that has to do with the fact that from where we started with that kind of weird violin line, it leads us into these chords, to where then we go into theme 2, but now it's backwards, and it's also rhythmically augmented in the beginning and also some other parts. Some moments are also forward when it's sort of a motivic moment, and in the entirety, most parts are normal speed and not actually augmented. Now this is in C minor. This ends on the note D, which is resolving on that note D. Of course, from here you could go D major, D minor, wherever you want to go. So then the next page begins in D minor. So we see that how I wrote theme 2, it allowed me to just basically write everything backwards, and it still worked. And we'll see throughout this, I then begin to take basically all the melodies from theme 1, theme 2, and the prelude, and also the bridge between those. And then I start to put everything backwards, sometimes forward in motivic moments, and I sort of create the second half of this development section, kind of starting right here, with all the melodies now being played backwards, rhythmically augmented and diminished, and sometimes even upside down as well. And many, many times in different keys, never in the original key that they were in the beginning. Okay, so we see some things. We see this sort of trying to take us to a quicker moment, and we sort of have some slower accompaniment going with those quicker moments, but then it keeps resolving into these very slow moments, and everything keeps getting dragged between, is it going to be faster, is it going to be slower? And at the same time, it is getting louder, but it keeps getting louder, and then it goes quieter from there. So it's like, okay, are we actually going to get louder? And there's that sort of conflict where we keep going towards getting really loud, but we're not quite settling there quite yet. So now we're going to listen to this last line, and then we'll see how this goes into the next page. Okay, I had to play the next page because that was just the ending of it. So now I want this whole thing to be minor. Originally, the prelude is trying to take you into that D major, the beginning of theme 1. Now every time that that's happening, that is instead going to D minor. And originally, the prelude was an A minor, and now that's transposed down a perfect fifth to D minor. Okay, now because the last page ended with that D note, which put us in D minor because this next page begins in D minor. This is still from theme 2 going backwards. Originally this was in D major, and now we have something kind of interesting happening here. It starts in D minor, but this is where the prelude actually ended and brought us into D major originally. That beginning section is now a variation, but now instead of D major, it's in D minor. Everything is now minor, and now that leads us into the prelude. But since this is the intro of theme 1, played backwards, then we'll see that the first line here is actually line 3 of the prelude played backwards. So it's basically going backwards from the ending of the intro of theme 1, ends on the beginning of that, and then it goes now backwards through the prelude, starting on line 3. The only thing is now we've heard the prelude used a few times throughout the development section already, and now if the listener is expecting a high moment, they're going to expect that high moment to occur somewhere here on the third line. But in fact, we'll see that this entire line draws that out and you don't hear the high point. So if the listener is expecting that, they didn't get that. And if they didn't really want to hear it, or if they were like, I'm not sure if I really want to hear that, now they didn't hear it, and now it's almost like they want to hear it. And now after that line ends, it goes on to the next line, where again, because everything's backwards, you still don't hear the high point until the very ending of this line, you finally get that high point again. And we'll see I labeled this is because the prelude is mostly backwards, and now it's in D minor. Starting from line 2 here, so where my mouse is hovering around, this is actually line 3 of the prelude backwards, and it's mostly backwards. So motivic moments and familiar moments I keep forward, so you kind of keep some more of that familiarity, and it kind of throws off you keeping track of exactly where you are, but it's still familiar and it still works. But then from that line 3 backwards, that finishes, and then you go to line 1 backwards. From there, then you go to line 2 backwards, and that's the very bottom line. Then that takes us to the resolution, which originally went to D major for the intro of theme 1, but now it just resolves in D minor, which is the tertiary key from the tonic key of theme 1. So that'd be scale degree 6 and minor. From there we see a half note rest of a pause, and then it goes on to the next page, where now with all that backwards stuff happening with the prelude, now we see the theme 1 chord variation. So in the exposition where I had that page where the violin was playing all those chords, we now have that backwards except for motivical moments again, transposed down a perfect fourth now to C minor. This is dominant preparation for the exposition, key 5, but it's in minor. We already know theme 1, it's nothing too exciting or anything like that, but now it's backwards and it's transposed to minor. So let's listen to what that did to this. Saw me turn my head there and I looked maybe kind of confused. It messed up this sort of section here. So see page 24 on the video that I uploaded for this actually sounds different. I'm not sure what actually happened here. How there's this double stop here. I'm actually gonna get rid of this top note, and I think I'll like how this sounds. Oh yeah, that was much better. Okay, we can see that it still has a similar feeling from before, but it changed quite a lot being backwards and now also in minor. And we'll see here I pointed out those thirds being played with those double stops in the violin, and this becomes a sort of useful melodic device that I use throughout the rest of this development section. You don't see it a lot, but you see it here and there. And oftentimes it's sort of used to take you from one moment to the next moment. So I most of the time use it for that, and sometimes I don't. We'll see that these notes don't directly take you to another moment, but they lead you up to a moment right before a change of the moment. Okay, so now we'll listen to this to the next page. Okay, so now this is kind of interesting because we just had theme 1 playing backwards, and we originally had a transition and prelude and everything, but instead of that, now we're just going into theme 2 backwards. We have theme 2, page 1, line 3 backwards, so it's starting from the very end of the second theme, the first version. And we have the end chord to the chord of the fermata, which you might remember from page 1 of theme 2. So it goes from the end to now backwards to that fermata, which is now a dotted whole note, which was originally in C major, the whole thing, and now the whole thing is in C minor. Okay, so you see what I mean where I said I kept the first movement of this violin sonata as very simple. I basically had my exposition, I had certain themes, I didn't change keys at all, I just wrote counterpoint above a given melody. In fact, I oftentimes kept that given melody as complete whole notes, and I wrote it so everything is playable, so it works, and it shows that you can have some interest even though there's whole notes being played the entire time, which isn't all that surprising, because a lot of rock music, you have a bass just playing something very basic. Not throwing shade at any bass players, there's some very complex bass lines. Just bass lines can be very simple. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the next page from here, but pay attention to the last chord. We'll listen to this last line again, because this last chord, the same chord continues. I might have added a few more notes, but it's the same exact chord after we have this little measure on the next page. So it's sort of like the chord continues, but we'll see that the feeling and what's happening with the music on the next page is different. So it's sort of like we took something from one sort of theme. We could imagine it like, okay, maybe we took a person there, maybe in the desert. Now the next page, we're going to take them towards a grassland. So there's persons still going to be there, but now we took the person to a new place. I don't know if that was getting a little too metaphorical and deep there. Okay, now let's listen to this last line to the next page. Okay, we see things get a little different here, and again we have a sort of theme that's conflicting with some quarter notes, and then we have a lot of half notes. For a little while it's kind of conflicting between the half notes and the quarter notes, but then it settles on a bunch of half notes and even some whole notes after that, so everything slows down quite a lot, and it's sort of building that as a rhythm, and then it's like, okay, so how do we break out of that? And we see those thirds with the double stops of the violin being used as another device, taking us from one moment to the next moment. Here there's also a rallentando, which I thought worked out perfectly in this moment. We see some counterpoint with the piano and then also with the violin. At the same time, everything's slowing down. We have those double stops with the thirds and the violin. It's taking us to a kind of a faster period. Then all of a sudden, we have that pause. Everything hits that quarter note rest while everything was just speeding up. Then we'll see everything lands with a dotted half note. Now you might say, what the heck's going on? We're in a 4/4 time. We keep having 4 beats per measure, but all of a sudden we have a quarter note rest, and then we have a dotted half note, and we have another quarter note rest. You think about that, we have 5 beats in this measure. So okay, is it just an accident? Should I delete the quarter note rest? No, I wanted a quarter note rest there, but I also wanted the next duration to keep continuing as kind of like a new section, but in 4/4 time. I didn't just want to have a single measure with one rest. That's kind of ridiculous. And I've noticed that during a lot of score reading, sometimes Bach will mess with the meter to where you have a 4/4 time, and then all of a sudden you have 5 quarter notes. So I've seen it multiple times, and it gave me an idea that, okay, well, you can have that freedom, just kind of saying, well, I want a quarter note rest right there. And that's what I did. I think it fit perfectly, and like I was saying, I didn't want that to enter on the first beat or the downbeat of the next measure, and nothing else really worked besides just making this a 5-beat measure and adding that extra quarter note rest. From there, we're back in 120 beats per minute. I didn't give it a tempo marking. I could have called it allegro, but in fact, I thought 120 just fit perfectly because that's what it started off with, and I didn't actually think about doing a tempo. I was just writing everything originally on pieces of paper and then transferring it to here, and I basically just worked with what I had. So if I did do a tempo marking, I would just call this allegro. And maybe I will change it to allegro and see if I like it like that. But from there, the A tempo, so returning to tempo, I could have wrote A tempo in here. Like I said, I'd probably mess with this a little more if people were actually going to be playing this, which if they are, I'll spend the time to do it. But for now, this is for the Muse score playback. And as I talked about, these double stops with these thirds in the violin take us to kind of a new moment. So let's see where they take us. Let's go back to the second line and listen to that, and we'll listen all the way through to the next page and see where this takes us. Okay, so now by this point you see a lot less notes. I don't remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure the reason for that is because I started fragmenting everything a lot more. I was taking little sections of the prelude and the transition, theme 1 and theme 2, and everything that I had, maybe even some extra material that I came up throughout the development section, and I started combining everything. Okay, and when I was listening back to this, when you hear the counterpoint, you can kind of hear a voice with another voice emerging. Sometimes you just hear the voice on its own and the other voice emerges. Sometimes they're playing together. I could get poetic here and say, oh, there's two conflicting voices and it's the opposing voices of someone's mind. There's the happy thoughts of trying to rise out of all the sadness of life with the higher notes, and then there's the lower notes emerging, which are reminding the person of all these sad moments and treacheries of life. Okay, but I am not really the type of person who likes to look at things in an artistic way and say that's what it is. Artistically, that's kind of maybe the perception I could get from it. That might be kind of interesting to think like that. But you'll see I like to think very logic-based and just think about, okay, what's happening here? Let's analyze that. Because if I start getting into all the poetic stuff, that will probably get into more territories of my opinions. And I'm trying to just lay out the facts of what's going on here as a result of what I wrote, as a result of the counterpoint, what's happening. And also another thing to note is that when I wrote this and wanted the ending product and everything, I wasn't looking for something that would blow the socks off people or something like that, or something that people listen to and say, I love that, I'll keep wanting to listen to it again. But instead I kind of made it for myself. I said, I want to make something that's very peaceful with the themes, maybe some interesting and exciting stuff in between that to keep me listening. But I want the themes, which is going to be the beginning for the most part, and then also the ending for the most part, to be very peaceful. And in my eyes, I accomplished what I wanted to make personally. So I feel accomplished. I feel happy with what I made. If someone doesn't like it, if you don't like it, you know, so be it. That's totally fine. I wouldn't mind hearing why you don't like it. Maybe I would see, okay, maybe I could improve that. Maybe there's something that could be done better. Maybe there's something that quite doesn't sound all that good. And if you point it out to me, maybe I'll notice it. So there's no shame in anything like that. It's just the fact that I made this personally for myself, and I actually listen to it a lot. If I have trouble sleeping, I think, oh, I can't sleep, what do I do? And sometimes I think, okay, I want to find a song, what do I listen to? And then I want to find something, and I just can't think of what to play. So oftentimes in that mindset, I'll just play this first movement of the Violin Sonata that I wrote, and listening to it, it's peaceful, so that helps relax me. But also that I spend all this time writing it and preparing for it and everything. When I listen to it, it's an accomplishment. This is what I created. And I think about all the time that I spent, and I think about everything that it took while I was creating it, and it kind of exhausts me mentally a little bit after I listen to the whole thing, because I think about all the stuff that went into it. Not to say it was an extraordinary amount of stuff, but it's just that when you want to go to sleep, thinking about all that stuff really helps me get in the mood to sleep. Again, we see the violin chords here and we see the counterpoint. So this very well might just be theme 2 but backwards. Not really sure. Whatever it is, let's listen to the end of this line and then go on to the next page and see where this line takes us again. So as we see, I kept it going for a little bit here. So did that sound familiar? And that's because that was theme 1 played in the home key, F major, and you see false recap with a question mark. And yes, this is a false recap. So you're supposed to hear this, and I didn't make this super strong or apparent, but you're supposed to kind of go, okay, so now we're kind of back to the beginning, especially if you're thinking about a sonata. You're hearing theme 1 in the tonic key again, you're thinking, okay, nothing special, we're just back at the beginning again, the recapitulation. We'll see that instead of completing the theme 1, it actually kind of just forms an unsure melody that starts to go a few places. You're not really sure where it's going to go, and then everything kind of falls apart near the end with these chords. Okay, that takes us on to the next page where we have a rallentando, and then all of a sudden everything slows down again, and you probably didn't expect it, but what you're hearing is those same notes as you did that are doing the counterpoint to the rallentando a few pages before this, to where everything slowed down and then you got into that different theme. Well, that happens again, except this time those double stop thirds of the violin, they all complete, and then they keep going, and they keep going for a whole nother measure, and then you're finally back at the 120 beats per minute A tempo, where you're back to that kind of different theme where we originally came from the rallentando a few pages back. I really like this theme, and I think that when I played it a few pages before, I kind of cut it off soon, and I didn't play it in its entirety, but I didn't feel like it wanted to keep going. So instead I ended it, but then I chose to go back to it here a few pages later, where it's the false recap, but then it takes you right back to the rallentando again, which is lengthened out a little further than you're probably going to expect, and then takes you back to A tempo with the original tempo. We have that theme going again, maybe makes me feel a little bit like a pirate theme a little bit or something. I don't know, something more cinematic is the feeling I get from this theme, or this section of the variation of the themes of the development. But then this all resolves onto this whole note here, but then this takes us on to the next page, where just like a few pages earlier, we have a very similar, almost identical ending, but this time harmonically, it's much more sure that we're actually ending in C minor, while the other one, if you look, some of the chords before ending in the C minor resolution added some different accidental notes, so we weren't quite sure if we're actually settling in C minor, if we're kind of just pausing there. While here it's a lot more solid of a resolution to actually say, okay, we're ending in C minor, we've been in there, and we're also ending there. We see some modulation where G minor goes to a C minor 6-5 chord, which goes to a G minor 6-4 chord, to a C7 chord, to a D6-5 diminished, to a G with the 11. And I might have not added that 11, I might have just added that as a note, and then might have not actually done that, I think, but I want to just move on, because I don't remember if that's in the D chord or G chord. Okay, so moving on, we see after that fermata, we also have an additional whole note rest, so a whole 4 beats. Okay, so now this brings us to the recapitulation. Now instead of starting in theme 1, we start with the prelude. So here, without the appoggiatura and the piano, we have a pretty similar section here to the first page, which was the prelude. Some things are kind of different, and I remember that I took parts of the original prelude and then also the developed prelude that was then backwards, and I sort of combined them to make them longer here, which where it kept leading towards and then away from that high point moment that you would expect to happen much earlier, but it keeps bringing you away from it, to where then on the next page we finally get that high point, but it's a little different, and it kind of follows what's been happening recently, is that the high point goes into a rallentando. Everything slows down. We really get a chance to hear some of the nuances here with certain things like the slight counterpoint happening within the high point of the piano and the violin, where we can see the rallentando is very short. It only lasts to the high point. And then as it kind of hovers in that high point, it goes back already to 120 beats per minute. We're back in A tempo again, and then everything goes back to a final resolution. So that's sort of the end of the prelude in the recapitulation. After this, we have another whole note rest, a whole 4 beats, where then we get into the recapitulation of theme 1. It's in the same key that it already was in, because theme 1 was in the tonic key, F major. It's almost identical to page 1 in the beginning, to where we have the intro to theme 1, the D major section, which then takes us to the beginning of theme 1, which I chose to just do as the octave doublings of the theme. So we see the violin playing the octaves of theme 1. Then instead of resolving, I wrote it in a way to where then that links on to the beginning again of a restated theme 1 with the violin playing the chords. That sort of goes out a little further to a resolution, but it goes towards the resolution, but it doesn't resolve. It sort of lengthens out and then steers away from that slowly. And that's where we get onto the next page here, where you get to a point to where you're not quite sure where this is going because you thought this was the recapitulation theme 1. Then all of a sudden you start to hear some moments that kind of hint at more dramatic moments found earlier in the piece. So you think, okay, are we just going to have one of those dramatic chords again or something? Are we going to go to something all high pitch again? But instead, that nicely brings you right back to the beginning of theme 1, restated again, just like on page 1, very simply, with just mostly a single line in the piano and violin, some double stops in the violin, mostly just single lines, which take you all the way to the ending, where you have a nice fermata ending, theme 1, now recapitulated. And then again, you have another whole note rest after that, taking you now to the transitionary period of the recapitulation. I really liked the transitionary period of the recapitulation. So for the beginning part of that, I basically have it identical because that's what I wanted. I didn't really want to change anything about it. And I also wanted to hear that again. I heard it once. I was like, I kind of want to hear that again. So now I hear it later when I listen to it. So here we are with that first page, which is the transitionary period, which takes you from theme 1 to theme 2. And as we can see, we're starting in F major here. By the end of this is surely changing with all the accidentals. Then we have those chords from earlier. We have a slight difference here, where basically there was that silent moment to where you heard the piano dun dun, and then you heard the violin dun dun. After that, that's kind of taken out. That doesn't exactly happen in this version of the recapitulation. But after that, the same thing happens just like in the original, to where that takes you to the ascending line in the violin, to where you have those triplets, to where it's skipping the middle note in the triplet when it plays that. Some measures it plays the triplet, some it doesn't. Leads you into those half notes, which go up to the high point, which then lead you to the high pitch chord, which you already got a taste of the high pitch chords before, but those were rather random. Now it's actually leading you up into a high pitched chord with more of like a plan, and you can hear that plan as it's being executed through the music. And then again, we see the counterpoint of the piano going down, violin going up, and they're actually making a sort of X, all while the left hand of the piano is slowly making its way up the entire time. This leads you to the next page, where everything is very similar to how it was originally, except I changed things with the implications of the harmonies of what's going on here, and also changed some things so it's not quite what you expect, and it's not so flip-floppy like the original version, but this time you actually have a little more modulating happening, and as a result, makes it a little more interesting. Then that goes to an end where you have 2 measures of whole notes slowing everything down. From there, I did 2 whole note rests, so 2 measures in a 4/4 time, which this entire movement is in. And now we're back at theme 2 finally. So the recapitulation. Theme 2 is now in the home key. We see it's an F major, which caused me to have to change some things with the register. In some instances, I put the violin up or down an octave, the piano up or down an octave in certain areas, and it changed the sound and nature of everything a little bit. We see dolce forte. I wrote that in expression text because it went from forte and then I went down a crescendo. And for me, it felt like it was kind of just a delicate forte. Still kind of felt like it had some of the power forte, but it wasn't quite forte. And from what I've been taught, that would be sort of like dolce forte. This was interesting because I really liked how theme 2 ended on the second page, to where I showed the counterpoint inverted. You had the whole notes on the bottom with the violin. It kept playing those whole notes. And then all of a sudden they went to the top, a few measures, and then they all collided together. I really liked that. So I wanted that, and I also wanted to change things around a little bit, so I thought, what could I do? So what I did was, here in theme 2, I took the second page, which had that crossing of the counterpoint voices, and I took the first 2 lines, and I put that here. And as you remember, the third line, the last line, is where those voices crossed. I replaced this third line with the third line of page 1 of theme 2. So the page right before it, still theme 2, and that had the alternate ending. So again, you had the alternate ending on the end of theme 2, page 1, but the beginning first 2 lines are page 2 of what it originally was for theme 2 in the exposition. Okay, after going through that alternate ending, which kind of has some faster notes, we go to the ending with the fermata. That's part of the reason why I wanted that as the first page. It has some faster notes in there, and I didn't want that on the very last page of this entire piece. Okay, so going on to the next page, we still see some quarter notes, but we don't see the alternate ending, and we see that overall things are slower here. Again, reminded that it is the dolce forte for what I wanted, what it sounds like it is to me. And then we see theme 2, page 1 of what was originally in the exposition here on the first 2 lines. So we see that fermata again, kind of slowing everything down, pausing everything. And this page, the first 2 lines at least, were a lot slower. So we get sort of the slower version of this here on this page. We also just had that fermata, and then we go to the third line, where now this is the third line of the second page originally. So if we're following everything, and now we're on the second page of theme 2 again. Now we're on that last line of the second page, and we have those voices crossing again. So just like before, the difference is that the first 2 lines are different. And now it's in a different key. So you still have those voice crossings, but I had to make it work with everything and still make it sound all right. And it's part of the reason why I didn't end this in a stronger dynamic with something like forte. It's because putting this in F major, I had to put everything either up high where it is or an octave below it. And I really liked it where it was. I didn't like it an octave lower. And at the same time, where it is this pretty high pitch up in the register, and it didn't sound very good here on the MuseScore playback in forte. So in a real life situation, I probably could have scored this in forte and had a much stronger ending, but it didn't quite sound very good with the high-pitched notes, and it sounded a lot better like this. Okay, so that's the end of this. Okay, so that's me analyzing the actual score. Now I'm going to get into some of the notes that I wrote down, and this will give light on how some of the ideas that I wrote down either were eliminated, or they were just evolved, twisted, or maybe they just inspired other ideas. Okay, so like I talked about, I started thinking and brainstorming about the recapitulation after putting together the exposition. So this is where the notes started. So I'm just going to read through it, and I'll see where maybe this changed, or maybe I went along with it. Okay, so recapitulation. So first start off with an A minor variation of the prelude into before leading into D major. So I definitely did that. Okay, so 2, B minor, the minor 4 chord of the tonic key, F. That transitionary period leads into theme 1 in the tonic key of F, and then makes its way onto theme 2 in the tonic. I said very dramatic and romantic, so it's kind of funny. I basically just took what I had, fiddled around with it, and kept it like that. Like I was saying, I kept this very simple. In future projects, I'm going to go for some things like, oh yeah, make things a lot more dramatic and romantic. For now, I'm going to keep everything how it is, because I think it was a good learning lesson for me, and could be a good learning lesson for other people as well, which is basically the reason why I'm making this video. So I'm going along with you, kind of pointing out some things more like on the outside, but if you really want to analyze it, you'd have to look at the notes, the chords chosen, and kind of look at everything measure to measure, look at the counterpoint. Okay, and then I have an idea 3, which I crossed out. And that says maybe the intro to the development period is a variation that is used to bridge theme 1 and 2, even though they are both in key 1. And then in parentheses I said probably not. It will add more interest. So we see that didn't matter because I actually ended up just keeping things like it was in the exposition, and I think I was overthinking a little bit here, and I didn't want to have the transitionary period again, but I actually ended up having the transitionary period again because I actually wanted to hear that. I have another note saying the prelude and transitionary passages alternate between B minor and maybe major. So not when they're put together, but on their own. Maybe they're alternating between minor and major, or maybe the prelude is in B minor while the transitionary period is in B, major or vice versa. And as we saw, I didn't quite do that. And then I said, or it could be the same structure as before, where the prelude leads into theme 1 and then transitionary passage bridges theme 1 and 2. In both cases, the prelude and transitionary passage are now mostly or 100% in B minor or B major if I choose that instead. And of course, thinking the tonic key, F major, so that would be chord 4, whether it's minor or major, being B. Then from there, I further had notes on my recapitulation, but here I start actually drawing everything out. So I started kind of writing down everything that would be in the exposition section. I wrote down the intro, which was an A minor, and then I had a brief modulation of D to F. That's the tonic key landing in F. Then that has a transitionary period or passage of chord 4 of the 4th degree of the tonic key of this movement, which is B minor. So it's the minor scale degree 4. That leads us into C, which is the dominant key compared to F, and that ends in a perfect cadence, so we have the 5-to-1. And 5-to-1 in the dominant key. So not C to F, but G to C. Then I wrote down an idea for my development section, saying that it should be fairly quick paced. Which is funny because in the beginning it wasn't very fast paced and it was also super quiet. But I guess throughout it I do have some fairly quick paced sections. I wrote down 1, the intro. I could have new material. I don't know what key this is going to be in. It could just be in C, which could then go into theme 1 in C, or theme 2 in a random key. From there I want everything to develop, of course, so that's the development section in its entirety. But from there I want the development section to establish in a tertiary key, either chord 3 or 6, which we see I did establish the tertiary key center of the 6th scale degree of the tonic key, which was when it established in D minor. And you see notes when I was talking about it, talks about when it establishes in the tertiary key center. From the tertiary key, since it went through a development section, and now it's on that tertiary key, which I chose as scale degree 6, then that is supposed to lead to the dominant scale degree. In other words, the key of C. And there's that dominant preparation of C, which then is going to land us in F, which we saw I did have the dominant preparation of C, but it was C minor. So it's C minor, which then took us back to F, where I had the prelude actually in F. But in my notes, I had the recapitulation. I was saying the prelude is now in B, either minor or major. From there, because that is the 4th scale degree of the tonic key, that lands on the tonic scale degree, so a 4-to-1 or a plagal cadence. So that's sort of adding to the balance of having the dominant to tonic relationship, which is 5-to-1, 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 the dominant to tonic, dominant to tonic. If we think subdominant to tonic, because subdominant means the dominant that is below, then we think, okay, we have the dominant and subdominant centering around the tonic, and we have that balance of those key centers. And yes, that is also why the 6th degree is called the submediant, because it is the mediant of the tonic of the key going down instead of up. And I guess while I'm getting into all this, and they also call the supertonic is not a super version of the tonic. Supertonic is just another way of saying it's the note after the tonic. Okay, so all that mumbo jumbo. So we landed in chord 1. We had the 4-to-1 plagal cadence, so that 4-to-1 relationship balancing out the dominant to tonic relationship. We need, of course, theme 1 to go to theme 2 somehow, because this is the recapitulation. These are both going to be in the tonic key, so in the middle of that should have new material that would get you ready to hear theme 1 in the tonic again, with lots of string and piano when theme 1 is back. Or maybe just the transitionary period from the beginning of the exposition, now in scale degree 4, so B, minor or major, or possibly both minor and major. That's what I have written in my notes. Okay, so some ideas there, and we see that I didn't do any new material, I just kept the transitionary period. Okay, next I have some more stuff for the recapitulation, which I wrote an arrow to, but above that I have a note, which is good because I actually haven't done this yet. And it's saying study Beethoven Violin Sonata 9. 1 is the Sonata Form, which I wrote in small letters, but bigger, which means it's more important. I said the arpeggiando is very well written. So the arpeggios on the violin, very well written. I want to study how he wrote it, how he notated it. Okay, so there's the note for that. But the recapitulation, I was saying maybe use a mixture or combo of forward/backwards And that is the prelude as well as the transitionary period in the middle sections from the development section, now in the recapitulation, to lengthen them more, keeping the outsides as original, but now in B if not already. So we see actually I did keep that note for the prelude of the recapitulation. Like I was saying, I took some of where it was forward in the original first page and some of where it started getting played backwards through the development section, and I combined those to make it longer, which also lengthened out the suspense that we didn't have that high point heard and then we finally heard it. Okay, so I did actually do that. And then I say below that, maybe a little modulation to C, or maybe even D minor, but mostly establishing B minor. So I don't think I actually did that, but there's probably reason for that. I could have done some more modulations, sure, but what I did and how it turned out is what I had in mind, and along the way, how I wanted it to end. I see one page where I see notes that just says motives, ending of page 1, theme 2, and then I have some weird squiggly lines, which meant something to me at the moment. And I remember I looked at it and I remember, oh yeah, I gotta do this, but I don't remember what it meant. Okay, moving on to the next page of my notes. Okay, there's a back page to that. And then I have some more notes for the recapitulation. I was saying the original theme 2 begins on page 2, but the last line is swapped with page 1. And then page 1 plays, but the last line is swapped with page 2. So I guess that's a lot more of a simple explanation than how I was explaining it, saying, oh, I kept the first 2 of this, and I kept the last of blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I guess I could have just explained it like that. The last 2 lines flipped. Okay, so as I talked about, I obviously did that. And then the transitionary chords that keep resolving into C from the transitionary period in the exposition are now more complex and resolving to F. F7, maybe F6 chords or inversions of F, etc. And then also maybe where I did that triplet rhythm with that note missing in the middle, maybe have a variation of that. So I definitely didn't do that. And I also didn't do a bunch of complex chords resolving to F, but I did change up the chords and do some more interesting stuff and kind of just change things up a little bit, still keeping with kind of the similar foundation from originally. We have another page about recapitulation. They say I was thinking about the recapitulation a lot, and writing a piece this long in sonata form and everything is very new to me. So I was writing all these notes down, brainstorming all these ideas. So on this page I say all in F major besides the prelude and the transitionary period, which I basically did. Theme 1 comes in as a variation and ends. Okay, so I did that. Theme 2, page 2 comes in as variation question mark, but page 1 comes in nearly identical, now in the tonic key of F. And then the end, and it shows a guy dancing. So I basically did that, except I didn't make theme 2, page 2 a variation. I just flipped the bottom 2 lines of page 1 and 2. Okay, my next page, I was seeing note combinations that I could do with B harmonic and melodic minor and not have tritones. A bunch of, like a kind of a web drawn for that. And then I see I have another page for recapitulation, where I have a note saying maybe the last movement of this entire sonata could be a rondo form. And I still think it's a pretty darn good idea. And then I have a note where I was saying I should make a separate one for each one of these, but I don't think I did. This would have been really time consuming. I basically just thought of some ideas, I put it together, I liked how it sounded, and I went with that. But here's what I originally wrote. I want the prelude in B major and B minor. I want the transitionary period in B major and B minor. I want theme 1 in F major and F minor. And I want theme 2 in F major and F minor. Furthermore, from the prelude and transition, I also want some alternative versions that maybe throw in some modulations to C minor and D minor in there. This is hilarious. I wanted a whole lot. And furthermore, theme 1 and theme 2, I want to try theme 1 and then theme 2, and then try theme 2 and then theme 1, because maybe that's what I want. So I wanted to make like a million different combinations and try out every single one and see which one that I thought would be the best. It's kind of hilarious. Maybe if I was doing like some master work or something, or like made something I was extremely proud of, that's actually kind of a good idea. Try out like every combination and even alternative versions, and then try those all together in different combinations and stuff, and even rearrange certain things like theme 2 and then theme 1, because you heard theme 1 in the beginning. So I've always thought, what if you do something like this? It's kind of just brainstorming now. You have theme 1, you have your transition, you have theme 2, you have your development, and then when you go all the way back, you just do it backwards. So you have some sort of section that leads you into, or you just go right into theme 2 for your recapitulation. Maybe you have a transitionary period again, and then end in theme 1. So it's basically like everything that happened before happen backwards. And maybe even your development section, you could kind of have that as a theme, to where you have a bunch of stuff that happens, and that stuff happens again, but kind of backwards. I think a simple structure like that would add some familiarity and some interest to the piece. Maybe that's an idea for something later on. Furthermore, getting into the notes, I have a page that shows some keys and their relationships. I show F major as the tonic. I have B minor, and I show the chords in that and also the notes. And I also show the tritone in every single key. I show that, okay, that's minor, and that's chord 4. And then I have C major, and that is major, and that's chord 5. And then I have some notes about some 7th chords and stuff, and relationships to other notes. I have a whole page with some scales. I have D major, C major, F major, G major, and B minor. E major, E minor, B major, B minor. And I basically have each one labeled major and minor, and horizontally I just have each note written out, so the accidentals. And then I have some notes about some unwanted notes because of their harmonic implications. Okay, I have some more scales written out. I wrote a note where I want something in 3/4 time that somehow modulates in common time, and to use that throughout it, which I did with the prelude actually. Okay, so moving on to the next page, more scales. And here I have C major, A minor, D major, D minor, D Dorian, and then if you put D Dorian composed up a 5th above, and how that would be the same notes as A minor. And then because that line is like it's an A minor, if you raise G like it's a leading tone and have G sharp, then now you have the notes of C major, but with the G sharp at the end of it. Now if you take all those notes and you transpose those down a perfect 5th, now you're in D minor. And that's because your F turns into a B flat and your G sharp turns into a C sharp. And of course C sharp would be the harmonic minor of D. So you had an A harmonic minor, those notes, you went to D harmonic minor. And that's because you're playing D Dorian, which uses the notes of C major, up originally a 5th, and you still remained in the same key. But then because that was raised up a 5th and that was an A, you now raised the leading tone, which now you have a G sharp. You transpose everything down a perfect 5th from there. And now you just transpose D Dorian into D minor. So that's how to do a parallel mode modulation. It's funny that I kind of explained that right now, because that is actually from my invertible counterpoint video. If you want to see a good explanation of that, where I actually have that drawn out in front of you and you can see that and read it and think about it, and I explain a lot more in depth, go to my invertible counterpoint video. My counterpoint playlist in the description. There's a whole lot of videos there about counterpoint, and it's still growing. Okay, my next page, I have some notes, so let's read it. I was saying we treat this line as A minor, and because of this, we think of A minor being transposed down a 5th. This is D minor. Now think of the raised leading tone of A minor. This is G sharp, transposed down a perfect 5th. And since we know C to G is a 5th, and since in C major, C to G is normally a perfect 5th, if we have G sharp, we transpose it down a perfect 5th, we can just think C sharp. So now we have C sharp, which is the note that is in D melodic minor's raised leading tone. So it went from a melody that was originally in D Dorian to a parallel minor mode. We had the original melody in D Dorian written to where it starts and ends a 5th above the given melody. Okay, and then from there it gets transposed down an octave plus a 5th, so a 5th down from the bass line instead of a 5th up. So since the melody was already written a 5th above, it goes a 5th down to D from A, and then it goes down another octave, so now we're in D minor. So we went from D Dorian to a parallel minor mode, but this is because of the position of the F in D Dorian, scale degree 3, which creates B flat. So already it transposed into natural minor, but the borrowed raised leading tone from the minor mode of C also transposed down a perfect 5th, to where then it was C sharp in D minor. Okay, so enough of that. The only reason I read all that is because that is basically the end of my notes, and yes it is. Other than that, I have some chords that are at the ending of Schumann's String Quartet number 4. I really liked them, so I wrote them down, and I was analyzing them, and I used it as an idea for the transitionary period in this. So I definitely didn't take the idea. It's much different than what he has, but it's the very ending chords of Schumann's String Quartet 4. So maybe you'll be able to listen to that and see where I was inspired in my transitionary period. Okay, so that's the end of this video. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. That'll help other people to see this video too. If you want to keep seeing more videos like this, especially videos on counterpoint, composition, and soon on orchestration, then make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any videos. And of course, feel free to leave any comments down below, whether that's an actual question or it is just a comment. I'll try to answer it to my best ability. If you want to get a hold of me, just email me at the email shown down below. And until next time, take care. Goodbye.